Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be talking about my continuing New Year's resolution to play all of the main series Final Fantasy games. And today we are going to talk about Final Fantasy IV, which of course does mean I finished it. I'm actually currently working on Final Fantasy V, which hopefully is coming soon. But let's get into talking about Final Fantasy IV. So, to refresh your memory, the plan for this year was there's 13 main series Final Fantasy games. There's 12 months in the year, and play as many of them as I possibly can to get through the series. With the idea of hopefully having played, if not all of the games in the series, at least most of the ones that I haven't played by the end of the year. Especially as, it's now November, right? So anyway, let's talk about Final Fantasy IV. So, Final Fantasy IV was actually one of the few early series Final Fantasy games, and early is being sort of relative, but early series Final Fantasy games that I'd actually played a significant amount of. So back in the day, I think I owned or obtained a copy somehow of the Game Boy Advance Final Fantasy IV. I remember I played it all the way until the Mount Ordeals situation, I think. I got all the way to that. I got to Cecil's big plot point there, and I think I quit very shortly after that. And I think I put it down or something. I had some idea of I'll come back to it later or something like that, and never really quite did. And that's sort of where it ended for that. At the time, I was pretty convinced I played about half the game. Now, having played it all the way through, I'm aware that I probably played 25-30% of the game, maybe max. But I did have some significant experience. I knew a lot of the early plot points. I knew most of the characters. So I went into it with some foreknowledge, more so than previous games, certainly. So in terms of how long did it take? It took me about 21 hours to finish the game. I didn't really do any of the special extra things or anything like that. But I did do, all the main plot things and so on and so forth. And I only really had 2 full party wipes. These were random weird things. I think one of them was like a random encounter or something or other, and I think one of them maybe was a boss. But other than that, I didn't really have a lot of struggle with this game, which I was, thankful for in a lot of ways. So let's talk about what I liked. So in Final Fantasy IV, I really liked the story. I went into it knowing some of the plot points and knowing the characters and all of that, and I really did like the story for the most part. There's a lot of weirdness to it, and there's some characters that get added on weird times or make comebacks, later in the plot, but you don't get to play with them anymore. Weird stuff like that, but I really enjoyed the story generally. It's a cool idea. Some of the twists are really telegraphed, but I thought some of the characters were cool. I thought their arcs were really nice. And I like the interaction between characters generally. And so I like that piece of it. Similarly to Final Fantasy III, I really enjoyed the modern features of this game. I played the sort of DS remaster, which is pictured here. I liked a lot of the features that were in the game. Being able to auto battle, being able to, have higher textures and things looking different and cutscenes and things like that. I like those modern features quite a lot. I wouldn't say that they are, make or break. I enjoyed it when it was sprites and everything on Game Boy Advance, but, those were nice. And the last thing that I really enjoyed was the augment system. And I'm unclear if this was in the original or if this is only in the remake or the remaster, but I really enjoyed the augment system. I was playing through the game early on and had no idea what they were, no idea how to use them. I even had to look at a guide to even figure out how to use them, much less what to use them for. But the augment system was super cool. The idea that you could give these augments to a certain character and they give you different abilities or you do different things. So for example, there's an augment that makes items do double damage. So you can use items or weapons in combat and they become a much more viable strategy. There's one that I remember using that I gave to Cecil. It was that encounters only target that person. So they become your tank, basically. And so it became a lot easier to manage certain fights because they're only targeting Cecil, right? And I loved the augment system. I actually it led to understand that there are many augments that you can only get by playing the game a certain way or playing a certain amount of times. And you can only give augments to one character per run. So there's a lot of depth there that I really think is super cool. That like there is a perfect way to do this and to play the game like 5 or 6 times. And I'm not going to do that, but I like the idea of it. I like the idea of augments, that you can really use these things that you get that really do change your experience of the game past just standard things like, oh, do you use magic or items or attack? I love that idea, and I think that's really cool. So I would highly recommend other games that have that. I like that idea. So let's talk about what I didn't like. So despite the fact that I really enjoyed the story of Final Fantasy IV, the plot points are often these like MacGuffins, which if you're unfamiliar with the term, MacGuffins are just like, this is a thing, it's a plot point that moves it forward. The thing doesn't actually matter. It's just a thing for the plot. There are a lot of MacGuffins in Final Fantasy IV. The amount of times that you're sent to like proper noun place to obtain proper noun object is really high. And like almost every time, the MacGuffin doesn't actually matter. It doesn't actually do anything. And that's really frustrating because you're just sitting there like, okay, I'll go to this thing and I'll do this and it'll be stupid. But there's a lot of that goes around. So I will say that isn't super fun for me. I think there would have been a way to make those things more meaningful. Not a deal breaker, not a game changing kind of thing. But it would make the game a lot easier, right? If you're just limiting the usages of those kind of tropes. The other thing that goes along with the MacGuffins, there's a lot of moving of goalposts. There's a lot of like, go here, do this. And then once you get there, now you have to go somewhere else and do something else. Or once you get that thing, it turns out that thing wasn't useful anyway because you're actually needing to do this other thing. And there's a lot of that goes around in the game. And again, it's kind of lazy, it feels like a lot of the time. There are times where it feels like it pads out the game a little unnecessarily. And that's not always a bad thing. But in this case, you notice it happening. And almost to the point of like when you get told to do something, that's not what you're actually going to end up doing. Or there's going to be like 5 more steps between you and that than you're being told. And that's kind of frustrating. I will admit that I got a little annoyed at that at times. The last thing is there are some annoying fights in the game. And this is obvious. There are some monsters that are just going to be a pain. For me, there are annoying fights, especially because there's a section in the game where you have to fight. I put a picture of a behemoth from the game. There's a section of the game where you have to fight like scripted battles against really tough monsters. And I think 3 of them, if not 4, all 4 of them are behemoths. And they're super annoying. And there's a lot of these that like the boss fights aren't that bad, but there are scripted battles that you have to have. There are some boss strategies that are frustrating. There's generally some annoying fights in the game. And again, it's not the end of the world. I genuinely had a decent time with most of it. Just that there are some moments where you're going to be like scratching your head or you're going to be frustrated because you're like, this isn't good. I don't enjoy this right now. So just things to remember. Maybe other people that have a different opinion, and maybe my tolerance for this kind of frustration is very low. But that's something that I was not particularly loving of the game. So let's talk about what surprised me. So in Final Fantasy IV, one of the things that really was surprising to me was how much it remixed classic elements of the series. So things that have been introduced before, like crystals and airships and magic and, certain kinds of monsters and different races and all of this. Final Fantasy IV does a really good job of taking those things and doing them in a different way. And in some ways, that's almost like what Final Fantasy II wanted to do, but Final Fantasy II went real hard with it. And Final Fantasy IV stays a little bit truer to those things. But as an example, right, there's these crystals, right? And you got to go save the crystals. Okay, sure. But the game starts with almost all of the crystals destroyed or captured or, whatever the plot point is. And so they remix it and flip it around and say, like, actually, there's more than this many crystals. Actually, the crystals do this, And so there's some cool bits of that where it kind of gives you a different flavor of something that previously existed. Another example is like airships. So you get airships. They're in the very beginning of the game. They're an integral plot point from the start of the game. But then you later get an airship that flies in space, that goes to the moon, and you're like, what? That's crazy. And things like that, where they take our classical element and they give it a little bit of a change. One of them is like the job system. So there isn't really a job system in 4, but Cecil has a class change. And Cecil changes type of character in his class change, which is super interesting. And it's like, okay, there's like a character growth arc to it, both in combat and out, but also it changes things up. It does different things for the gameplay mechanics, that kind of stuff. And I really like that kind of idea. Another one is I really liked a lot of the characters in the game. I liked Cecil as a character. I thought he was kind of cool. I like the arc they give some of the characters. All of them have some sort of reason for being there. Some of them do some very interesting bits of growth. So, for example, Edward, who is the character that gets the sort of spoony bard line, the original, goes from being this sort of like wussy, sort of meh, self-centered guy to, by the end, being this really interesting, powerful, together character. And not to say that all of them have these like wonderful moments, but the characters really stand out in Final Fantasy IV in a way that the previous games just didn't do. In a lot of ways, 4 is really the first one that the characters have personality, and there is sort of the story element for all of those characters. And I think they execute it very well for ultimately something that's sort of the first try in some ways. And the last thing I really liked is I liked the depth inherent in the game. There's a lot of things you can do, a lot of mixing and matching. The abilities, the augments are really cool. The ways you can set up the game. There's a lot of hidden things that are really cool, that are, good depth, that if you wanted it, it's there. If you don't want it, you can play it straight up standard the entire way through and probably not even have a struggle, or at least much of a struggle. But if you want to get real interesting, real weird with it, like there's augments that allow 2 characters to tandem cast magic, and it's like, oh, that's really interesting, because now you can start doing weird stuff with it. And there are augments that like make really big good amounts of sense on certain characters, but there are augments that you could spread them around and do really weird and cool stuff with them. Now, obviously, I think there are some that there's a right way to do it and a not right way to do it. But I like that the game gives you depth. One of the things that as characters exit your party, you also eventually get things like augments that you spend on them back if they're not going to be playable again, which is a really cool thing, because then you kind of get new ways to build characters. And so I liked that piece of it. It was surprising, at least. So here's my verdict. So I genuinely was surprised in a good way by Final Fantasy IV. I knew going into it that it was interesting. I was probably going to like it a little bit more than previous games. But it was a genuinely good surprise. After playing 2 and 3, which were very frustrating for me, 4 was a nice change of pace. It was very story-focused. It had some cool beats. The story's kind of cheesy and hokey in a lot of ways, but I really enjoyed it. And it was a nice surprise for me. And honestly, the verdict, one of the things that surprised me about it was I almost wished I could play the game again. Because I was reading a guide that held these interesting ideas, and like you can go find these items and you can play it on this, do it this way. And it sounded cool. Like, again, to get the maximum way out of it, you can play it 3 times, and I'm not going to do that necessarily. But I liked the idea that you could play the game 3 different times with 3 different things and build your characters constantly each time. And I almost wished I wanted to do that. I'm not going to, but maybe someday, right? And honestly, I got invested in the story. It was interesting. There were a lot of like cool questions that you can answer. And I know that there's a follow-up, the After Years, which I hear is very bad. But I almost wished I could play it. Like I was sitting there like, oh man, I wonder if After Years is any good. And like I know it's not, right? I hear it's not, at least. But the game was enough for me to be like, you know what? That might be kind of cool. What if I did that? Would that be fun? And I haven't yet, but I thought about it. Like I saw it on sale one time and I was like, ooh, yeah, that would be cool. No, wait, it wouldn't be cool. Don't do that. But, it made me invested in the universe and want to play more in it and see what happens to the characters and see, what happens to the world afterwards, because there's some interesting, cool things that happen. And I really enjoyed that. So food for thought. But anyway, with that being said, that is my retrospective of playing Final Fantasy IV. Let me know if, there are things I missed in the game or things that maybe would have changed my experience. Let me know if it's maybe worth to go back and play again, or to play after years or something like that. I'm curious to hear your thoughts and opinions. But with that being said, I will go ahead and see you in the next one when we talk about Final Fantasy V.